Police officers brutally assaulted an elderly disabled woman, certain they would face no consequences. However, they had no idea that her son was someone they never wanted to cross. How will this shocking incident unfold? Will justice prevail, or will corruption allow the perpetrators to walk free? The consequences for their actions are inevitable, but just how severe will they be? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this gripping story. Leave a comment. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear your thoughts. The sun shone brightly on a crisp autumn afternoon as Meline Wilson, a 70-year-old black woman confined to a wheelchair, navigated the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood. She had just finished a visit to the local bank, a small but meaningful victory in her otherwise routine day. Despite her physical limitations, Meline always managed to take care of her own affairs. Her son Julian, a prominent attorney and activist, often offered to help her with errands, but Meline was fiercely independent. Though age had taken its toll, and an old injury had left her bound to a wheelchair, her spirit remained unbroken. Dressed in a modest coat and scarf, with her handbag resting neatly in her lap, Meline moved down the street with ease. Her bright, alert eyes scanned the peaceful surroundings, and she smiled faintly at the distant sound of children playing. Her thoughts, as they often did, drifted to her son. Julian was a strong man, successful, intelligent, and deeply committed to justice. He had made a name for himself in the city, fighting for the rights of those who were often overlooked. Meline was endlessly proud of him, but she had always been careful not to rely on his influence. She had raised him with the values of hard work and integrity, and she lived by those same principles. But on this day, Meline would face a challenge she had never anticipated. One that would test not only her resilience, but also the very foundation of the justice she and her son had spent their lives fighting for. As she turned onto a quieter street, heading toward her home, 2 white police officers appeared from around the corner. Dressed in full uniform, their faces were stern, unreadable. The moment their eyes landed on Meline, something dark flickered in their expressions. One of the officers, a tall man with a shaved head, narrowed his eyes as he approached. "Hey you," he barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. His partner, a shorter, stockier man, followed closely behind, his eyes scanning Meline with equal suspicion. Meline, initially taken aback, stopped her wheelchair and looked up at the officer. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, keeping her voice calm. She had no reason to be alarmed. She had done nothing wrong. This was her neighborhood, but the way they were looking at her sent a chill down her spine. "We need to see your ID," the tall officer demanded, stepping closer. His presence loomed over her, and she felt the immediate shift in the air. The once peaceful afternoon was now thick with tension. Meline frowned, confused by the request. "My ID? Is there a problem, officer?" "We ask the questions," the stocky officer snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. "Just show us your ID, lady." A wave of frustration swelled in Meline's chest, but she kept her composure. With slightly trembling hands, not from fear, but from the anger building inside her, she reached into her handbag and pulled out her identification. She handed it to the tall officer, who snatched it from her without a word of thanks. He glanced at it briefly, his frown deepening, his eyes narrowed further, as if the simple act of reading her name gave him some sort of displeasure. He turned to his partner, his voice low and dismissive. "This ID looks fake," he muttered, handing it over. "You sure this is yours?" Meline's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly steadied herself. She had been through too much in life to be intimidated so easily. "It's mine," she replied firmly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. That ID is as real as it gets." The stocky officer let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. He tossed the ID back to her carelessly, a sneer curling on his lips. "You don't seem like the type who belongs around here," he said, his voice laced with barely veiled racism. "What are you doing in this part of town anyway?" Meline felt her stomach tighten, but she met his gaze with unwavering determination. "I just came from the bank," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I live right down the street." The tall officer scoffed, his expression mocking. "Sure you do," he said sarcastically. "And I'm the mayor." His partner, feeding off the growing hostility, stepped closer to Meline's wheelchair. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to her handbag. "You carrying something you shouldn't be?" Meline felt her pulse quicken. This was beyond an ID check. This was harassment. But she refused to let fear take hold. "It's just my personal belongings," she said, gripping the handles of her wheelchair tightly. "You have no reason to go through my things." The stocky officer's face twisted with irritation. "We'll decide what's necessary," he growled, reaching down to grab the bag from her lap. Before she could stop him, he yanked the handbag away and began rifling through it, his movements careless and aggressive. Meline gasped, a surge of anger and helplessness washing over her as she watched him toss her belongings onto the pavement. "Stop that!" she demanded, her voice rising. "You have no right to do this." The tall officer chuckled darkly. "We have every right," he said coldly. "People like you need to learn to respect the law." Meline felt the words hit her like a slap. "People like me?" she repeated silently, fury simmering beneath the surface. "What exactly do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice shaking. But neither officer bothered to answer. Instead, the stocky one smirked as he threw her handbag onto the ground and grabbed the handles of her wheelchair. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said, his tone final. "You're under arrest." Meline's eyes widened in disbelief. "Arrest? For what?" The stocky officer didn't answer. Instead, he began pushing her wheelchair toward their squad car, his grip rough and unkind. Meline struggled, her hands flying to the armrests as she tried to resist. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The tall officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as he leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You're nobody. You don't belong here. And now you're going to pay for it." Melina's heart pounded in her chest. How had this happened? How had a simple trip to the bank turned into a nightmare? Her mind raced, but one thought echoed above all else. Julian. Her son was the only one who could stop this, but would he get there in time? "You don't seem like the type who belongs around here," the tall officer sneered, his voice laced with thinly veiled racism. "What are you doing in this part of town anyway?" Meline's blood ran cold. She had heard comments like this before, words that questioned her right to exist in certain spaces as if she were an outsider in her own neighborhood. But never had it come from a police officer. She looked up at the men, her back straightening in defiance. "I just came from the bank," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I live right down the street." The tall officer scoffed. "Sure you do," he said sarcastically, "and I'm the mayor." His partner, feeding off the growing tension, stepped closer to Meline's wheelchair. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to her handbag. "You carrying something you shouldn't be?" Meline's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear control her. "It's just my personal belongings," she said, gripping the handles of her wheelchair tightly. "You have no reason to go through my things." The stocky officer's face twisted with irritation. "We'll decide what's necessary," he growled, reaching out to grab the bag. Before she could stop him, he yanked the handbag from her lap and began rifling through it without her consent. Meline gasped, a wave of anger and helplessness washing over her as she watched him carelessly toss her belongings onto the ground. "Stop that," she demanded, her voice rising. "You have no right to do this." The tall officer chuckled darkly. "We have every right," he said coldly. "People like you need to learn to respect the law." Meline felt those words hit her like a punch in the gut. "People like me?" She repeated the phrase in her mind, fury simmering just beneath the surface. "What exactly do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Neither officer answered. Instead, the tall one motioned to his partner, who tossed her handbag onto the pavement and grabbed the handles of her wheelchair. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said, his tone final. Meline's eyes widened in disbelief. "Arrest? For what?" The stocky officer didn't bother to explain. He simply began pushing her wheelchair toward their squad car, his grip rough and unkind. Meline struggled, her hands flying to the armrests as she tried to resist. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong." But her protest fell on deaf ears. The tall officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as he leaned down toward her, his face mere inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You're nobody. You don't belong here, and now you're going to pay for it." Meline's heart pounded in her chest as she stared up at him, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had a simple trip to the bank turned into this nightmare? Panic surged through her as the reality of the situation began to sink in. These men had no intention of treating her fairly. They were using their power to humiliate and degrade her, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The stocky officer yanked her wheelchair forward again, dragging her toward the squad car. Meline's body jolted with each rough movement, pain shooting through her arms as she struggled to hold on. "Let go of me," she screamed, her voice filled with fury and fear. "You have no right to do this." The officers only laughed, their cruelty now fully exposed. As they neared the squad car, the tall officer pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting ominously in the afternoon sun. Meline's pulse quickened. This is wrong, this is so terribly wrong. She knew her rights. She knew that what they were doing was illegal. But her words seemed powerless against their authority. Just as the officer reached for her wrists, something inside her snapped. With every ounce of strength she had left, Meline jerked her arm away and shoved at the officer's chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch him off guard. He stumbled back a step, his eyes flashing with surprise, then rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, lady," the stocky officer growled. Before Meline could react, the tall officer recovered and lashed out, slapping her across the face with brutal force. The impact was immediate. A sharp, blinding pain exploded across her cheek as her head snapped to the side. A stunned gasp escaped her lips, and for a moment everything blurred, the pain, the shock, the disbelief. She had been hit before, but never like this, never with such hatred. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as the officers dragged her closer to the squad car. Their movements were rough, unforgiving. The tall officer grabbed her by the arms, forcing her out of the wheelchair. Meline's body, already weakened by age and injury, crumpled beneath their assault. She felt the cold pavement beneath her as they threw her down, her head spinning from the pain and shock. "Get the hell up," one of the officers shouted, kicking at her legs. But Meline couldn't move. Her body was too battered, her strength too drained. All she could do was lie there, helpless and broken, as the officers continued to berate and assault her. The last thing she saw before her vision darkened was the crowd that had begun to gather nearby. Their horrified faces stared back at her in disbelief. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and righteous anger, Meline reached out and shoved the tall officer with all the strength she could muster. He stumbled back, momentarily caught off guard by her defiance. The stocky officer, his face twisted with rage, tightened his grip on her wheelchair. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, lady," he growled. Before Meline could react, the tall officer recovered from the shove and lashed out, slapping her across the face with brutal force. The impact was immediate. A sharp, blinding pain exploded across her cheek as her head snapped to the side. A stunned gasp escaped her lips, her vision blurring with tears. The world around her seemed to freeze, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had been hit before, but never like this, never with such hatred. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as the officers dragged her toward the squad car, their movements rough and unforgiving. The tall officer grabbed her by the arms and began to force her out of the wheelchair. Meline's body, already weakened by age and injury, crumpled beneath their assault. She felt the cold pavement beneath her as they threw her down, her head spinning from the pain and shock. "Get the hell up," one of the officers shouted, kicking at her legs. But Meline couldn't move. Her body was too battered, her strength too drained. All she could do was lie there, helpless and broken, as the officers continued to berate and assault her. The last thing she saw before her vision darkened was the crowd that had begun to gather nearby, their horrified faces staring back at her in disbelief. Meline lay on the cracked pavement, her body aching from the blows, her mind spinning from the assault. The world around her blurred as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Pain pulsed through her face where the officer had struck her, the sting of the slap still fresh. She could taste the metallic tang of blood on her lips, and her frail arms trembled as she tried to push herself up. But the strength she once had seemed to have left her completely. The two white officers towered over her, their sneers twisted with an ugliness that only years of unchecked power could bring. The tall officer, the one who had struck her, leaned down again, this time with more menace in his eyes. "Get up, you old hag," he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can shove me and get away with it?" His partner, the stocky one, let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Yeah, show her what happens to people who think they can act all high and mighty, especially someone like her." Meline's heart pounded in her chest, but her body refused to cooperate. She could feel her legs trembling, useless beneath her, as she tried once more to push herself upright. Her wheelchair had been knocked over in the scuffle, lying just out of reach. Desperation surged within her as she reached for it, her fingers barely grazing the metal frame. Before she could make contact, the stocky officer stepped forward and kicked it farther away, sending it skittering across the pavement. "Where do you think you're going?" he mocked, standing over her like a predator savoring his prey. The weight of their cruelty pressed down on Meline, suffocating her. She had never felt so powerless. But even as her body betrayed her, even as pain racked her limbs, her spirit refused to break. The growing crowd murmured louder, their whispers of outrage growing into shouts. More people had stopped to watch, their phones raised, capturing every moment of the horrific scene. For the first time, the officers hesitated, their confidence faltering. They had expected obedience, submission, but now the weight of too many eyes was upon them. A voice from the crowd rang out, sharp and unwavering. "Leave her alone." The officers froze, their smug expressions shifting as they turned toward the gathering crowd. Meline, still struggling to move, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice was finally catching up to them. The officer loomed over Meline like a bully taunting a defenseless victim. His boots were inches from her face, and she could feel the oppressive weight of his presence. "You're not getting out of this one, lady," the tall officer sneered. He grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her up from the ground as if she were nothing more than a rag doll. Meline winced in pain as her body protested the harsh treatment, but she refused to cry out. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You're resisting arrest," he growled, forcing the metal handcuffs onto her wrists with such force that they bit into her skin. "That's going to cost you even more time in jail." "Jail?" Meline managed to say, her voice weak but filled with disbelief. "For what? I haven't done anything." The stocky officer bent down so his face was level with hers. "Ooh, but you did," he said with a sinister smile. "You thought you could talk back. Thought you were better than us. We don't let people like you get away with that. People like you." The words stung deeper than any physical blow could. The veiled racism in their voices was now out in the open, and Meline felt the cold weight of their hatred settle over her like a suffocating blanket. These men didn't see her as a person. She was just an object of their contempt, a victim to be toyed with. A small crowd had started to gather around them. Neighbors, passers-by, people curious about the commotion. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, but no one dared to intervene. The fear in their eyes was palpable, and Meline could feel the helplessness that hung in the air. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. "Please, just let me go home," Meline pleaded, trying to appeal to whatever shred of decency might still remain in these men. But her words only seemed to amuse them further. "You ain't going anywhere," the tall officer said, pulling her roughly toward their squad car. "Not until we teach you a lesson about respect." Meline struggled against the pull, but her body was too weak, too frail. The cuffs dug deeper into her wrists and she could feel her strength fading fast. The pain in her legs throbbed and she stumbled, barely able to keep herself upright. She was no match for the brute force of these men, and they knew it. The stocky officer grabbed her wheelchair and threw it into the back of the squad car as if it were nothing more than a piece of trash. He then opened the door and gestured for his partner to throw her inside. "Let's take her for a ride," he said with a sneer. "Show her what happens when you mess with the law." But before they could shove her into the car, a voice rang out from the crowd, sharp and filled with anger. "Leave her alone." A woman stepped forward, her face etched with shock and horror as she watched the officer's manhandle Meline. "He didn't do anything wrong." The tall officer whipped his head toward the woman, his face twisting in irritation. "Mind your own business," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." But the woman didn't back down. "She's a disabled woman. What kind of monsters are you?" Her voice cracked with outrage and she pointed her phone directly at the officers, making sure to capture every second of the abuse. Others in the crowd began murmuring in agreement, the tension building with each passing moment. More phones were raised, more voices joined in. The officers had expected silence, expected submission. Instead, they had an audience, one that was watching, recording, and refusing to look away. The tension in the air was thick as more people in the crowd raised their phones, recording every second of the horrifying scene. Their murmurs had turned into loud shouts, demanding justice, but the officers didn't seem to care. If anything, the growing defiance of the crowd only seemed to fuel their rage. "You're interfering with police business," the stocky officer barked, his hand inching toward the taser on his belt. "You want to end up like her?" The woman who had spoken out earlier instinctively took a step back, but she didn't lower her phone. Her hands trembled with anger, her voice unwavering. "I'm recording all of this," she said. "People will see what you've done." Meline could feel the shift in the air. The weight of silent judgment was pressing down on the two officers. The growing unease of the crowd, unmistakable. Yet, the officers seemed undeterred by the watchful eyes around them. They had no fear of consequences, no fear of being held accountable. The tall officer turned his attention back to Meline, his patience worn thin. "Get in the car," he ordered, his voice cold and unrelenting. But Meline could no longer stand. Her legs buckled beneath her, her body crumbling under the weight of pain and exhaustion. She had fought as hard as she could, but her body was failing her now. She collapsed onto the pavement, unable to move. "She's resisting," the stocky officer shouted, a twisted grin on his face. "She's making this harder on herself." "Resisting?" Meline gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I can't move." The officers ignored her words. The tall officer grabbed her roughly by the arm, this time with more force, and began to drag her toward the squad car. The murmurs of the crowd grew into shouts of protest. "Stop, you're hurting her," someone yelled. "This is police brutality," another voice called out. But the officers didn't stop. The stocky one knelt down beside Meline, his face inches from hers. His breath reeked of cruelty, his voice low and taunting. "Nobody's going to help you," he whispered with a smirk. "People like you don't get saved. We're the law around here." The words sent a cold shiver down Meline's spine. She had never felt so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of those who were supposed to protect and serve. Her mind raced, searching for some way out, some way to end this nightmare. The stocky officer stood up and kicked her wheelchair aside, sending it crashing into a nearby curb. The sound echoed through the quiet street, a brutal reminder of her helplessness. "Let's take her down to the station," the tall officer said, his voice now laced with a sickening enthusiasm. "Teach her a real lesson." As they moved to haul her into the squad car, something changed. The crowd, once hesitant, erupted into full-fledged outrage. People who had been silently recording now shouted at the officers, their voices rising in a collective wave of fury. "This is wrong," someone yelled. "Get away from her," another voice demanded. The pressure from the crowd was mounting. Meline could feel the shift in the atmosphere. More and more people were stepping forward, their phones still recording, their anger growing. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other as if unsure of what to do next. They had expected to intimidate, to assert their power without consequence. But now, too many eyes were on them. "Back off!" the stocky officer barked at the crowd, his hand resting on his taser. "This is official police business." But the crowd didn't back down. Instead, they grew bolder. Their voices grew louder. "You're going to get caught for this," a man shouted, stepping forward. "You can't just beat on someone and expect to walk away." The tall officer clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Meline and the restless crowd. He grabbed her by the arm again, but this time with less confidence, his grip faltering. Meline winced in pain as he pulled her up, but she couldn't hold herself steady. Her legs gave out beneath her and she collapsed back to the ground, her body crumpling under the strain. "She's faking it," the stocky officer yelled, his frustration boiling over. "Get her in the car." But Meline's body had reached its limit. She lay there, breathing heavily, her vision blurring as she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. The tall officer, his patience gone, raised his hand to strike her again. But this time, before the blow could land, a voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "That's enough." The entire crowd fell silent as the voice rang out, deep and commanding. The officers froze. The tall one lowered his hand, turning toward the source of the voice. The sea of people parted, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered black man striding toward the scene. His suit was sharp, his stride unyielding, and his face was twisted with fury. Julian Wilson, Meline's son. The officers' expressions shifted instantly, their bravado faltering. The tall officer's sneer wavered, and the stocky officer instinctively stepped back. They recognized him. Everyone in the city did. Julian was not just any attorney. He was a man who had built his career tearing down corrupt officers just like them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Julian's voice was low, simmering with barely contained rage. The tall officer straightened, his fingers twitching. "Sir? Step back. This is—" "Don't even try it," Julian cut him off, stepping closer. His gaze burned into them, unwavering. "You just assaulted an elderly disabled woman in broad daylight. My mother." A murmur of recognition swept through the crowd. Gasps rippled among them. The stocky officer's confidence crumbled. "Look, we were just—" Julian took another step forward. "You were just abusing your power. You were just violating her rights. And you were just caught on dozens of cameras doing it." He turned to the crowd. "Make sure you send that footage to me, every single one of you. I want their faces, their words, everything." The officers glanced at each other, panic creeping into their features. "You're done," Julian said, his voice lethal. "Call your supervisor. Now!" The tall officer hesitated for only a moment before pulling out his radio, his fingers shaking. The crowd began to cheer. Justice had arrived. The command came with the force of a thunderclap. "That's enough." The voice was deep, authoritative, and laced with a simmering rage that sent a chill through the air. The officers turned in the direction of the sound, and the crowd instinctively parted, revealing the speaker. A tall, broad-shouldered black man strode purposefully toward the scene. His suit was sharp, his stride unyielding, and his presence commanded attention from everyone in the immediate vicinity. He was no ordinary bystander. He was Julian Wilson. His face, usually calm and composed in the courtroom, was now twisted with fury. His sharp eyes locked onto the officers standing over his mother, Meline, who lay helpless on the pavement, her body bruised and broken from their assault. Julian had been on his way to visit her after an important meeting when he saw the commotion from a distance. Now, standing before the officers, his jaw clenched, his rage barely contained. Seeing his mother, the strongest woman he knew, reduced to this, treated like a criminal by the very people sworn to protect her, sent waves of anger surging through his veins. His voice was like steel as he demanded, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The tall officer, still looming over Meline, sneered, "And who the hell are you?" Julian stepped forward, his fists balled at his sides, his gaze locked onto the officers like a predator cornering its prey. "I'm her son," he said through gritted teeth, "and I'm also Julian Wilson, attorney at law. You just assaulted an innocent woman, my mother, and I will make sure you both answer for this." Recognition hit the officers like a brick. The tall one's sneer faltered, his posture stiffening. The stocky officer, still too stubborn or ignorant to grasp the gravity of the situation, stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "You better step back, sir," the stocky officer growled. "We're handling official police business here." Julian didn't flinch. His voice dropped to a low, cold tone, one honed from years of dismantling corrupt men just like these. "Handling it," he scoffed. "You're breaking the law right now. You've committed battery, unlawful arrest, and abuse of power. You think that badge makes you untouchable?" He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not." The tall officer shifted uncomfortably. His bravado, so fierce just moments ago, began to waver under Julian's unrelenting stare. The crowd, emboldened by Julian's presence, began murmuring louder, their anger swelling into a chorus of defiance. Some even cheered. "That's right," a man shouted. "You can't just beat on people like that." "Arrête! Justice for Meline!" another woman yelled, raising her phone higher, ensuring every second of this confrontation was captured. Julian's sharp eyes flicked between the two officers, reading their every move. He could see the flicker of indecision in their expressions now. They were starting to realize that this situation was spiraling out of their control. But the stocky officer, too arrogant to back down, made one last desperate attempt to assert his dominance. "We're taking her in," he snapped, his hand moving toward his taser. "You can't interfere with police business." Julian's voice dropped to an even lower, more dangerous register. "You lay another hand on her," he said, each word measured and lethal, "and I will personally see you prosecuted for assaulting a disabled senior citizen. You will lose your badge, your pension, and any future in law enforcement." The stocky officer froze, his hand hovering over his taser. The weight of Julian's words pressed down on him like a crushing force. He looked to his partner for support, but the tall officer had already taken a step back, his confidence shattered. Julian took another step forward, standing as a shield between his mother and the officers. His eyes burned with the righteous fury of a man who had spent his entire career fighting for justice. "Call your supervisor, now." The tall officer hesitated for only a moment before yanking his radio from his belt. His fingers trembled slightly as he called in for backup and a supervising officer. The stocky officer, still too stubborn to admit defeat, muttered something under his breath but didn't make another move. Julian knelt beside his mother, his fury momentarily replaced by concern. His expression softened as he gently touched her shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Meline looked up at him, her face bruised, blood staining her lip. Despite the pain, she managed a faint smile. "You're here now," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "That's all that matters." Julian's heart clenched at the sight of her. His strong, resilient mother, his hero, had been brutalized by men who thought they could act without consequence. He turned his head slightly, glaring at the officers who now stood off to the side, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of the crowd, but the damage had been done and they knew it. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 additional squad cars pulled up to the scene. A supervising officer, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, stepped out and made his way toward the group. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on the 2 officers. Julian rose to his feet, his expression hard as stone. "What's going on?" he said sharply. "Is that these 2 officers assaulted my mother without cause. She did nothing wrong and they beat her while she was on the ground. I want them arrested and charged with battery." His voice didn't waver. "And I want an internal investigation into this entire incident." The supervising officer turned to the tall officer. "Is this true?" The tall officer shifted uncomfortably. "We were just doing our job," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your job?" Julian scoffed. "A 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair was resisting arrest? That's your excuse?" The supervisor's expression darkened. He turned back to his officers. "Step away. We're handling this properly." The stocky officer shot Julian a glare, but the confidence in his eyes was gone. The moment was lost. They had been exposed. As the officers were led away, the crowd erupted into cheers. Julian turned back to his mother, gently holding her hand. "Mom, I swear to you," he said softly, "they won't get away with this." And he meant every word. Julian's heart clenched as he looked at his mother. His strong, resilient mother, reduced to this by men who thought they could get away with anything. He turned his head slightly, glaring at the officers who now stood off to the side, trying to avoid the piercing stares of the growing crowd. But the damage had been done, and they both knew it. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tense silence, and within moments, 2 additional squad cars pulled up to the scene. The doors swung open, and a supervising officer, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, stepped out. His sharp eyes swept over the crowd before settling on the 2 officers at the center of the commotion. "What's going on here?" the supervisor demanded, his voice firm but measured. Julian straightened, his demeanor composed, but the anger burning inside him was unmistakable. "What's going on," he said, his voice sharp, "is that these 2 officers assaulted my mother without cause. She did nothing wrong, yet they threw her from her wheelchair and beat her while she was on the ground. I want them arrested and charged with battery, and I want an internal investigation into this entire incident." The supervisor's face darkened as he turned to the 2 officers. His expression unreadable, he asked, "Is that true?" The tall officer shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiff with tension. "We were just doing our job," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. "She was resisting," the stocky officer added, though even he sounded unsure of his own words. Julian's expression hardened, and he cut them off before they could say anything else. "Resisting?" he scoffed, stepping forward. "A 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair? That's your excuse?" His voice grew sharper. "She wasn't resisting. She was trying to defend herself from your assault. And there's video evidence to prove it." He gestured toward the crowd, many of whom still had their phones raised, capturing every second of the confrontation. The supervisor inhaled deeply, his gaze flickering between Julian and the 2 officers. Finally, his expression turned grim. "You 2 step away," he ordered, his voice laced with authority. "We're going to handle this properly." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd as the officers reluctantly moved back. The color drained from their faces as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The stocky officer shot Julian a glare, but the confidence behind it had vanished. He had been exposed for the bully he was, and there was no talking his way out of it now. As the supervisor spoke into his radio, calling for further assistance, Julian turned his attention back to his mother. He knelt beside her, his expression softening as he checked her for any serious injuries. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have been here sooner. I should have protected you." Meline, despite the pain coursing through her body, reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on her son's arm. "You've always protected me, Julian," she whispered, her eyes filled with warmth and love. "You came when it mattered." Julian swallowed hard, pushing down the lump that had formed in his throat. There would be time for emotions later. Right now, he had to make sure justice was served. As the police investigation team arrived on the scene, the supervising officer walked over to Julian once more. "Mr. Wilson," he began, his tone now professional and respectful, "I assure you we will conduct a full investigation into this matter. The officers involved will be suspended pending the outcome." Julian nodded curtly, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "That's a start," he said. His voice was steady, but the fire in his eyes remained. "But I'm not just looking for suspensions," Julian said, his voice firm. "I want them charged. I want them held accountable for what they did." The supervisor hesitated, his expression tense. Finally he nodded. "We'll do what we can. I'll make sure you're kept informed." Julian's jaw clenched as he stood, watching as the two officers were escorted away by their colleagues. They no longer held the arrogant confidence they had displayed earlier. Now they looked like men facing the real consequences of their actions. The crowd, which had gathered in anger and disbelief, began to disperse. Some approached Julian and Meline, offering words of support. Others promised to share the videos they had taken, ensuring that the world would witness the injustice that had taken place. The truth would not be buried. Julian helped his mother into a waiting ambulance, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. As the paramedics tended to her injuries, he sat beside her, holding her hand. He vowed silently that this was far from over. Justice had to be served, not just for his mother, but for every victim of police brutality who had suffered in silence. That night was endless for Julian Wilson. He sat by his mother's hospital bed, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face, but his mind remained sharp, already planning his next moves. Meline rested, her body sore, her face bruised, but her spirit was intact. Julian knew her strength well. She had endured a lifetime of challenges, and he had inherited that same unshakable resolve. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from colleagues, reporters, and allies flooded in. The news of the attack was spreading rapidly, and so was the outrage. The two officers responsible for the assault had been taken into custody, but Julian knew that wasn't enough. A temporary suspension or a quiet internal investigation wouldn't bring real justice. They needed to be held accountable, not just as individuals, but as part of a system that allowed such abuse to go unchecked. As the city slept, Julian worked. By sunrise, videos of the assault had gone viral. The nation was watching. Outrage exploded on social media, and activists, community leaders, and even politicians began speaking out. Julian's legal team wasted no time. They filed a formal lawsuit against the police department, not just targeting the two officers, but also holding the department responsible for fostering an environment where this kind of brutality could thrive. By midday, protests had erupted outside the police station, the streets filled with people demanding justice. Signs reading, "Justice for Meline" and "End Police Brutality" waved high in the air. The pressure was mounting. The police chief, clearly feeling the heat, scrambled to control the situation. He released a statement calling the incident a misunderstanding and vowing to conduct a full investigation. But Julian wasn't fooled. He had seen these tactics before. Vague promises, empty reassurances, all designed to deflect blame. He wasn't going to let them downplay what had happened. That afternoon, Julian stood outside the hospital where his mother was recovering, surrounded by a sea of cameras and microphones. Reporters crowded around him, eager for a statement. His voice was steady, his expression calm but unwavering, his eyes burned with determination. "This is not just about my mother," he began, gesturing toward the hospital behind him. This is about every person who has suffered violence and discrimination at the hands of those who are supposed to protect them." He paused, letting his words settle. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "This is about a system that continues to fail Black and disabled citizens, treating them as less than human," he continued. "My mother did nothing wrong. She was treated like a criminal simply because of who she is." The anger in his voice was unmistakable, but so was his resolve. "We will not rest until justice is served. Not just for her, but for every person who has been targeted, humiliated, and brutalized by a broken system." The crowd erupted in applause. As the media coverage intensified, the pressure on the police department became unbearable. News outlets replayed the footage of Meline's assault over and over, while community leaders and civil rights organizations demanded action. Julian knew they had the momentum now. The police department could no longer sweep this under the rug. The world was watching, and they would be forced to respond. He glanced back toward the hospital where his mother lay resting. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time since the nightmare had started, he felt hope. Justice was coming, and he wouldn't stop until it was served. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with people eager to witness the outcome of a case that had come to symbolize a greater fight for justice. The energy in the room was electric, charged with tension, hope, and anger. Julian stood at the front not just as his mother's advocate, but as a representative for every victim who had ever suffered at the hands of unchecked authority. As he spoke, his voice was steady and firm, unwavering in its pursuit of justice. "These officers thought they could act without consequence," he said, pacing before the jury. "They believed that because my mother was old, Black, and disabled, no one would care, but they were wrong. We care. This community cares, and today we are here to show them, and everyone like them, that we will not tolerate this kind of abuse any longer." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The jury sat in silence, absorbing every syllable. The defense attorneys, once smug and confident, now looked defeated. They had tried to paint Meline as combative, claiming she had resisted arrest, but the evidence was undeniable. The videos, the witness testimonies, and the medical reports painted a clear picture of cruelty, not duty. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." A wave of relief, mixed with quiet triumph, washed over the room. The officers, once so sure of their power, sat frozen in disbelief. Their badges had not protected them this time. They had been exposed for what they were, abusers of the very system they had sworn to uphold. The judge wasted no time in issuing their sentence. Prison time. A full investigation into the police department, sweeping reforms, including mandatory sensitivity training and independent oversight, to ensure that incidents like this would never happen again. For Julian and Meline, this was a victory, but it was also bittersweet. As they exited the courthouse, they were met with cheers and applause. Supporters gathered around them, shaking hands, offering hugs, and expressing their gratitude. Reporters shouted questions, but Julian ignored them for the moment. His priority was his mother. Meline, still recovering from her injuries, gripped his arm for support. She had lived long enough to see too many injustices brushed aside, but today, justice had been served. Weeks passed, but the impact of the trial remained. The case had ignited a fire that spread far beyond their city. Protests for police reform erupted in towns across the country. Activists used Meline's story as a rallying cry for change. In their small living room, Julian and Meline sat watching the news. Footage of protests, interviews with community leaders, and policy discussions filled the screen. Meline turned to her son, a soft smile on her lips. "You did it, Julian," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You made them listen." Julian shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Mom, we did it. Your strength, your courage, that's what made this possible. You've been fighting your whole life. I just followed your lead." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Maybe. But I'm proud of the man you've become. Proud that you're using your voice to stand up for what's right." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the news anchor discussed the new police reforms being implemented across the city. For Julian, the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now they had momentum. Now they had a platform. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the room, Meline leaned back in her chair, a deep sense of contentment washing over her. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be challenges, resistance, and those who would try to undo their progress. But she also knew that with her son by her side, they could face whatever came next, together. They had turned pain into power. And with each passing day, the world was changing, slowly but surely. The story of Meline Wilson teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience, justice, and the power of community action. In a world where abuse of power can often go unchecked, it is crucial to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Meline's experience reminds us that no one is immune to injustice, but it also highlights the strength found in perseverance and the importance of fighting back against oppression. Her son Julian embodies the principle that knowledge and determination can bring real change. His refusal to back down, his commitment to seeking justice, and the support of the community ensured that those responsible were held accountable. This story serves as a call to action. Always be aware, speak up against wrongdoing, and support those who seek justice. No one should suffer in silence, and when we unite against injustice, real change becomes possible. Stand firm, stay vigilant, and never let injustice go unchallenged. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Click the bell to be the first to know about the latest videos. Leave a comment. We value your opinion. Where are you watching this video from? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to check out our other videos. You won't be disappointed. See you in the next story.